So today we want to talk about batteries, how they're connected, how they keep us connected to energy, and how that influences sustainability. So yesterday we ended the lecture with very respectable figures, Obama and one of my favourite, David Attenborough. So just to throw things in the mix, we're going to start, and this is not on. I don't think. There we go.
Actually, need to get the little dongle out the bottom. Plug you in. Give me that. Talk amongst yourselves for just a second. You should be fine. Just give me a trial advance. Okay.
We're good. We're good. So, David Attenborough, Obama, and let's start today with Trump. Why store energy? Well, it's okay to say we're going to build a big wall and we're going to put solar panels on it, but can we actually access the energy that we generate? No, not unless you have a transmission grid, not unless you have some form of energy storage capabilities that actually gives you the energy where you need to use it. So, you know, try as you might, I don't think Trump in this cartoon here is actually going to connect up. Of course, it's never good to start the day with politics, in my point of view, and what do we need to do to mitigate Trump shock? Well, the only thing I could think of last night, and given that Chris has introduced you and said there's reasons why I'm up late at night, and it's not just to do with batteries, I thought I'd give you a couple of photos. As you can see, my now 2-year-old, we're priming him for the All Blacks team, making sure he wears the All Black jersey. He's 2 years old, he's the size of a 3-year-old, so we're thinking prop. And Kellen is now 6 months old. So there you go. There's something to mitigate the Trump shock. So why store energy? Well, one of the reasons is energy needs to be portable. We want energy on our phones, and we need to be able to walk around with them. Same with the car. We cannot connect the car while we're driving, so energy needs to be portable. We need it in remote places. We don't just want to be in the city, connected up to the grid. We sometimes want to be out in the bush, or I hope the penguins give you an idea of maybe just how remote it is. So maybe this is a research station, I'm not 100% sure, but we still want energy in different places at different times. So this would be an off-grid example. We also want to store energy so when we need it, we can ensure we've got energy security. So this is for instances like the South Australia blackouts. We want to ensure we can provide power to homes across the state or across Australia all the time, because your consumers get really annoyed if they go home and find they can't cook their evening dinner or turn on the air conditioners. We also want to be able to use it at times when energy that we're generating is not available. So photovoltaics will only work during the day, and you've got typically a 6-hour window. Same with wind. The wind does not blow all the time, and in fact it can be very intermittent. So with the use of energy storage, we can start mitigating those on-off events and actually provide constant power. So if we're looking at it in terms of renewables supporting the grid, we need to realise that electricity is the only major commodity that cannot easily be stored in large quantities. Have you actually thought about that? It's very difficult to store electricity. So the lack of storage generally in society means that we're driving wholesale electricity prices. So in low demand periods, you may pay $100 per megawatt hour, But when the demand is high, those prices can ramp to extremes, and you can pay anything up to $12,500 per megawatt hour. There is a huge difference in price depending on demand, and demand drives that price. So the electricity supply system must be able to cope with high demand, and those high maximum demand periods only occur a couple of hours during the day, and when the absolute extremes, like when the temperature is really, really hot, they only occur a couple of times a year. But we need to make sure the grid can cope with maximum demand. So about 15% of our national electricity network caters for peak periods, just peak periods. So that is about 11 billion worth of infrastructure costs being used for about 100 hours or 4 days a year. That is an awful lot of money for 4 days a year. So what is driving growth in peak demand? Well, it's consumerism. It's about consumers now wanting to access the grid for various reasons. And one of the major contributors to this is Australian homes now installing air conditioners or evaporator cooler units. So basically in 1975, we had just over 20% of households with an air conditioning type unit in it. That ramped up into the 1980s, dropped off a bit, but then from about 2000, we saw this massive increase in the number of homes installing air conditioning units. So we're now in 2011, so we're just over 70%, and that's probably close to 80% now if you take that line upwards. So 20% to 80%, that's a huge increase in the amount of electricity that consumers and the average person like you and me wants to access at certain periods of the day. And it's when we all come home from work or from school or whatever we're doing, and we all turn on our air conditioners and that light at night, and turn on our ovens and turn on our lights, and that's what's driving the peak demand. But storage can give you the ability to link with the load. So you can have variable generation and you can have variable load, but we can counter all that with storage. So when we talk about renewable energy, we have a transmission grid. So here the transmission grid provides energy where it is needed. We transport the energy to your home, to the office, to commercial environments. And the energy storage provides the energy when it is needed. So we don't necessarily need it all the time, but it enables us to use it as and when we want. So let's have a look at a grid situation. Here I've used an example from a French. This is a French example. It shows the weekly load and supply curve. It's back in 2013, and this is January, so we're looking at a winter period. So what you need to realize is that electricity power systems are challenging to operate, and this is because they have a lot of variability in their demand. So here we have the white line represents the demand over the period of a week. So what we need to see is that realize is that demand can change daily, weekly, and seasonally. Even it can change hourly. What you need to understand is that we have some idea of what the demand may be, but it's impossible to predict with 100% accuracy. So that provides all sorts of challenges for power regulators and making sure there is enough power coming to the grid to support everyone's needs. So what happens to do that? Well, you would often, in Europe you probably have a nuclear reactor that provides a general baseline demand to meet your demand requirements. And then you would add different sources on it, such as hydro, to meet these peak demand spikes. So hydro, coal, natural gas, and oil. And when the demand changes, you would go to your grid operators, and they would look at their load, and then they would speak to the generators and say, what is my flexibility requirements? How quickly do I need to get power coming back into the grid? What is the technology that can turn on the most quickly, or knowing that the ramp might be over a couple of hours, what source suits that ramp time? And most importantly, what is the cost of production at that particular day, at that particular season? So the things like hydropower, coal, natural gas, they'll be ranked in an order of merit in terms of flexibility and cost, and then your grid operator will say, let's turn on that power station or that power station, depending on the needs and how that all works out in the mix. So in this scenario, we don't store electricity. We use primary resources such as coal, such as natural gas, to actually provide electricity and energy as and when we require it. But it's not necessarily the most effective way of doing things, and we are eating into our natural resources. We don't necessarily have to do that if we start looking at renewables such as wind and solar. Excuse me. So what happens when we add things such as wind and solar into the grid? Well, we've already seen that the grid has a lot of variability, and some of it can be predicted, but not all of it. Now, when we add wind and solar, we actually increase the amount of variability of the supply into the grid. Again, the output varies according to daily, seasonal patterns, and we have some idea of how they might work, but what we can't always predict is the weather. And solar and wind are highly dependent on what's going on with our weather systems. So here is an example from Germany, and this is showing the consumption and supply, demand and supply for wind and solar over the period of a month. So all the peaks down here in the orange are the days where the solar, where we have solar. Some days are great, they're nice and sunny. Sometimes we have absolutely nothing at all. And again, wind is in the green, and you can see that is highly variable. And what you need to recognise is that the black line demand here is much more stable, although it's variable, than the wind and the solar. So they're not matching. So what we need to do is store energy from these sources when it's available, and then deliver it back into the grid when the demand is required. We don't want to just run the energy into the grid, because we have oversupply, and that has all sorts of connotations for grid operators as well. So what are the two primary functions that we can think of for grid storage? And the first one we can think about is load leveling. It's a fairly simple concept. Basically, we generate electricity, maybe in the early hours of the morning, and then we can store it. This is probably when prices are low, so we store the energy. Or as the sun comes up, we may have solar coming into the system, and so we store that energy because we don't need it right now. So the ability to store means we can shift that use later in the day when we start to have peak demands coming in. And so instead of using it all up when it's generated, we now shift that use into like a 4 p.m. or an 8 p.m. peak cycle here. This takes out the peaks and sort of levels your supply load into the grid. The other thing that is also used for is ancillary services. And so this would be something like leveling the frequency of the electricity coming in, or maintaining the voltage, because the grid operators will have limits on how much they can sustain in variability, and so they will say you can only go outside of your frequency of 50 hertz, you have this range, and then beyond that we start to run into problems, and same with voltage. So ideally we just want the operational frequency of the system to be at 50 hertz, and we would like that to be constant. But in reality, it is actually quite variable, and we don't want it to drop below the minimum, and we don't want it to exceed the maximum, because then you have to put in response systems to that to avoid things like blackouts or spikes in the grid, which can cause other problems. So there's ways that they can do that, but why not put in a battery where you can help level the load and level these services? So we'll look at examples where that can be done successfully. So a PV plant with electricity storage. This is very much what we discussed in the last slide, but the electricity storage can be used to shift it later in the day, so our demand is low overnight and then increases throughout the day. And we generate PV energy during daylight hours, and if we would supply that straight into the grid, we'd have an excess of energy. So we store that and we shift it later into the day when we actually need it. So here again, we can use it to firm and smooth the output, help integrate into the electricity supply, and then and also avoid wastage. So we don't run off coal or run off natural gas when we don't have to. So what we should look at is, where do we need storage to support ancillary services? And when we look at it, we need to look at how storage applications relate to their power ratings. So the power, we talked about this yesterday, is the ability to withdraw and inject energy to and from the grid instantaneously. And the discharge time is the other thing we need to look at, and that's the time it takes to provide the energy. So looking at this, we see we can have discharge times for anything from seconds to months in a grid situation, and a power from anything from 1 kilowatt to 1 gigawatt. And that scale here will often be dependent on the type or the size of your power station. So one of the biggest areas that covers quite a range of discharge times and power ratings is intermittent balancing. And at some point, batteries can fit in this space. We have transmission and deferral, so that's moving electricity usage to different times. That's also a fairly significant area. Power fleet optimization, looking at how we can just simply optimize the whole system to work effectively. Provide black start services. This is happening generally on an hour, and this is to get something going from scratch if it's been out of service. We want to ensure power quality. That can run from minutes up to hours, and then providing an operating reserve. So right across the range of power, and anything from seconds to up to 30 minutes is where you would need to look. So we can think of storing energy in terms of, we get it from our renewable energy resource, so in this case it's wind. We then charge our system, so this is our battery system. We can think of the battery as empty, we take the energy from the wind source and we charge our battery. So it can be thought of as in terms of consumption, and we look at how much energy can be withdrawn from the wind system here, and how much, and we look at things like ramp rate, how quickly it takes to charge that storage system. We then think about it in terms of storage itself. So this is the storing phase. It's characterized generally by how much energy you can store with that system, and it's a time shifting dimension, because we store that system and then we use it later. So then we discharge our storage unit, or our battery in this case, and again that maps into how much energy can be provided into the grid if we inject it into the grid, what rates it goes in at, what ramp times, how quickly you go from nothing to something, and all those sort of factors. So the property of the energy storage system will depend on the breadth of the application. So we often talk about the power to energy ratio for a storage system. So if you have a 8 megawatt charging device and a 48 megawatt hour electricity storage capacity, then 48 divided by 8 means it will have a charging time of 6 hours. If we re-rate that system to 4 megawatt hours, but it's still a 8 megawatt charging device, then it just takes 30 minutes to charge that storage system. So it is a higher cycling frequency. So we can rate our storage systems and change how fast or how slowly we can deliver power in and out of our system. So when we look at batteries, we need to map where they may most effectively overlap with some of the needs of an electricity storage applications. And so here we've got the same scales, seconds to month, 0.1 power rating to 1,000 megawatt power rating. And what we can see is that batteries cover this huge area here, and that's going to cover quite a lot of your intermittent balancing, but most importantly, it's covering the area where you want to have transmission and distribution deferral. So here we're looking at batteries where they can store the energy and then use it later. Some batteries can be used for power quality, some can be used for black start services. Generally, they're okay up to a point in storing energy over a certain period of time, as it's so operating in keeping energy in reserve for when you most need it. And if we can't use a battery, we do have other options. So high power supercapacitor for when we need power really, really quickly, through to superconducting magnetic energy storage down here. We've got compressed air up in this corner, pumped hydro up in this corner. But what about this gap? Perhaps one day we can push batteries into this zone, or we have to develop other technologies to meet the needs of the power grid in this area. So if we look at batteries, there is a number of different types of batteries out there, and here's where you need to choose your battery very carefully to be able to meet these power requirements, because not one single battery will operate over that entire space that we just looked at. So if we look right down the bottom, here was the first example I gave you yesterday of a double layer capacitor. So electric double layer capacitor is what EDLC stands for. It has a high power rating, so we can charge and discharge quickly. So that one sits right down the bottom. Of course, it doesn't have a lot of energy, so there's only so much we can use that for. But then we look at lithium ion, which covers quite a wide range. We've got nickel metal hydride, nickel cadmium batteries, and here we've got VR is your vanadium redox, so that's a flow battery. It covers a fairly significant range here, and the zinc bromine battery, probably not quite as adaptable to grid applications, but still has a use. And I guess you'd go through, particularly when they overlap all these batteries, and look at how long they would last, how much cycle life you get out of them, and what is the cost. So you'd look again at the relative merits of each battery and before deciding which battery type to put into your application. So I'd like to show you, as much as possible, some examples where batteries are used in real-life situations. And they're not easy to actually find real information out there because a lot of it is confidential or hidden behind the power grid supply. So I've actually rung up a friend at eCult, the Australian battery, ultra battery, and got some examples from him, which he's allowed me to use for this talk. It's all based on their marketing material, so it's not confidential, but it's, I just want to thank Richard personally, because he's enabled you to see where batteries are actually used in Australia today to help support renewable energy. So this is a HAMPTON wind farm. I think it's south of Sydney, in New South Wales, so it's not too far away. This is here they've used the ultra battery to support a wind farm, and the problem that they're facing, it was actually to smooth the load. So this project was done in conjunction with CSIRO, and it was purely a testing facility. The project ran for 4 years, and after 4 years they resold the batteries because they still have plenty of life in it. So this wind farm doesn't actually need to be smooth, but it was a perfect test bed to show what a battery can do for the system. So one of the issues with wind is that it's very variable, and in fact you can go from a lot of wind to absolutely nothing within a space of a few seconds. And the grid cannot cope with that amount of change really, really quickly. So over the period of, they chose a 5-minute period, they looked at how a battery can be used to smooth the variability. So here we have the renewable source, so that's the wind, over a period of 5 minutes, and you can see it fluctuates quite a lot even in that time period. Now if we put in a battery system, and so the energy is captured into the battery and then delivered back into the grid, we are able to smooth it to about 1/10 of the raw output. So rather than the grid having to be designed around such variable load, we now have an almost constant load, and we don't need to engineer the grid around that. So the battery in this case has really helped to smooth the system. So this one here is a P&M Prosperity Project. It's a US facility, and it was the first solar energy storage facility that was fully integrated into the utility power grid. So what they were finding in this situation is that they would have, this is a solar power grid, so everything would be working fine, and all it would take is for a cloud to come in, and you could drop energy into the grid almost instantly as well. So cloud cover was actually a huge issue at some points. And you could go from the green line here, the white line, it's almost the same. You could go from absolutely nothing with cloud cover to a whole lot of power coming into the grid, and that would be variable depending on the conditions, and then it would drop off again. So very difficult to manage again. It's the same as wind. It's highly variable, and the grid can't cope. So what they did is they used the Equals Ultra battery and integrate it into the system. So it's big enough to support a 500 kilowatt solar energy farm, and then we've got 500 kilowatts of power smoothing capability. And they were able to shift the energy capability by about 250 kilowatts per megawatt hours of energy. What that means is that, as you can see here, the battery comes in, and as the solar is generated, the battery is storing that energy rather than feeding it into the grid, and then it starts to, as it reaches capacity, it starts to mirror the generation, but on the whole, it is a whole lot smoother than what they were getting without battery storage. So this one is not storing energy for later, it's actually using the battery to smooth the system. So let's talk about, come back to home and how it looks like for the individual, for you and me. And we want to have a look at renewables and home energy storage systems. I'm just going to get my notes so I don't forget things. So here we've got your famous example of the Tesla Powerwall. So this is, I think it's a beautifully designed system. I think when you have a battery and you're going into the consumer market, design is so important. So Tesla have done very well in terms of promoting this. So in a home energy storage system, you don't necessarily want to disconnect from the grid, but you do want to be able to choose when you use your power, and perhaps when you see those peak demands coming, Maybe you want to go off-grid and save yourself money and use the energy that you have created during the day, which is your solar panels, and take that, so you created that during the day, you've put it into your battery, you see a peak price coming through, and you go, hey, let's get off the grid, I'm going to use the battery energy. So we actually don't do this very much at all now. What we do is generate our electricity during the day, and then we feed that back into the grid and we sell it back to the operator. Now, in times gone by, that was actually a very good option, because you'd probably, I think when the early days of tariffs and rebates came on the scene, you'd probably buy your energy at, say, 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and you could sell it back to the energy company for 30 cents per kilowatt hour. That deal's off the table. You no longer get those rebates. It's no longer as cost effective. So what would we do? Well, if we can, we put it into a battery. So to do that, you'd have your battery plugged into your garage, on the side of your garage or in the basement of your house if your house is big enough, and you would need it connected to the solar panels. So you have a battery and an inverter system. Now, the inverter system is there because your battery runs on direct current, and when you talk to the grid, you've got AC current, so you need to be able to convert direct current to alternating current, so that's why there's an inverter there. And then we need our battery to talk to our electric panel and our electric meter, and then finally to the utility grid. So what are the key things you need to think about? Well, if you've got a battery sitting in your home, you don't actually want to have to manage that on a daily basis, and most batteries do need management on a daily basis. So you would have installed within that battery system a battery management system, and that is designed to actually control the parameters of your battery. So if you have, let's say, 3 or 6 lead-acid batteries sitting in your home, you want all of those batteries to operate at their optimal capabilities. But batteries are not going to operate all the same. You can never manufacture a battery absolutely perfectly so they all look identical. So over time, you might find one of your lead-acid batteries tends to lose power or lose voltage, and maybe it's sulfating more quickly than the other battery next to it. So what you would do, your battery management system would do, is recognize that there is an inconsistency in how the battery is operating. And then maybe at the end of the day, when you're not using that battery system, your battery management connectivity would kick in and go, we need to recover that battery and it needs to look the same as that battery. So let's give that an equalizing charge. We talked about that yesterday, and let's make it level that battery. So when they talk to each other, they look the same. You don't want to have a battery that's slightly under voltage and one slightly over voltage, because when it all works out in the system, you probably drain your poorer battery first, and rather than the bigger battery, and so therefore your whole system becomes imbalanced, and therefore the life of your whole battery system altogether is actually shorter over time. So the battery management system is really key to be able to mitigate any problems. And it's not a simple solution, because you can't just go, I'll go and buy a BMS off the shelf and go and plug it in, because every battery works differently. So lead-acid battery manufacturers are trying to get into this realm to compete with lithium, so they're trying to develop their own battery management systems that are specific to lead-acid batteries. Lithium-ion suppliers are trying to do the same based on the lithium-ion chemistry and how they need to be optimized. And it's the same with even the flow batteries. The flow batteries are probably the type of battery where you don't optimize at the upper voltage, at top of charge. You probably optimize the battery at the bottom of charge, just because the chemistry works better to do that. So each manufacturer of different types of batteries are now building their battery management system to work with their individual batteries. So there's a huge market out there for development, and there's not one single solution, and I think it's actually one of the most challenging areas of battery management at the moment. So What would you put in your house? I personally would go for a lead-acid battery, maybe because I've worked with them, but they're an old technology, they're cheap, and they're reliable. But this is a lithium-ion battery, and I think what we need to realize is that while they may be sexy, would I put this on a wooden house? Not a chance. I'd maybe put it on a brick house. If it catches on fire, I'm not going to burn my entire house down. But if they do go up in flames, the fire brigade will come out, but they probably won't touch your battery because lithium burns really, really hot, and it's actually really difficult to put out, and they'll probably stand there and wait till the lithium has burnt itself out, and then they'll come in. Because once you react lithium with water, it's actually highly reactive and it just keeps going. So from a consumer perspective, I think it's really important to be informed about what type of battery you're putting into your house and what are the risks involved. And hopefully we're getting to the point where battery companies actually minimize the risk, but I do think consumer beware and consumer be informed. One of the things they never talk about is what happens when your battery is spent. So who pays for the costs of recycling your lead-acid battery? You've bought your battery from your electricity company or your battery supplier. 10 years down the track, are they going to be there to take the battery away? And I think, so all these sort of things come into the costs of a system, and the consumer is not necessarily on top of all these things right now. In fact, what we don't have in Australia and what is being developed is a battery standard system. These are in place for lead-acid batteries because they're so old, so they come from European standards, and Australia and New Zealand match those standards. But we don't have lithium-ion battery standards. There's nothing in the EU, and I know that they are actually developing it in Australia. But there's been a lot of talk around, do we actually ban lithium-ion for household because of the risk? And that ban hasn't come through, but it is something that's currently being discussed in the field. So a lot of interesting concepts out there. Can it actually work for your household system? I think yes, down the track. We do want to go to storing energy, but it's at what is the cost? So the Tesla Powerwall, the last time I looked, cost about $8,000. But that doesn't include the price of inverters, and inverters aren't cheap. You probably look at easily putting $5,000 on that. And then there's the installation costs. So we're up to 13, maybe installation is another 5, and then we're up to $18,000 just to put a battery system in your house to talk to your solar panels. And this assumes that you've already got solar panels that are new enough and can talk to your battery system. So solar is probably $5,000 to $8,000. So we're looking at over $20,000, $22,000 just to put an energy storage system in your house. And where's the payback? Well, at the moment, there is no payback because there's no tariff system from the government to support these rebates. So you're probably looking at a 15 to 20-year payback period to put this sort of system into your house. Now, these days, people don't necessarily stay in their homes that long, so you may add it to the value of your house, but will you get your money back? And I'm not sure that you will at the moment until we see some regulation come in. The same with the red flow system, and this is where it gets tricky for consumers because Tesla will come along and say, oh, it's only $8,000, but then you've got to add everything else on. And then you go to the red flow zinc bromine battery, and they say, oh, it's $17,000, and you think, oh, but actually that includes everything. It includes the inverter, it includes the installation costs. So it's really, there's no consistency across manufacturers, across suppliers about prices and ranges. And so once again, it's down to, at the moment, it's down to the consumer to do the research and make sure they know what they're getting. So one of the interesting things I think that's going on at the moment is that home energy storage is becoming really, really popular in India. Now, it's actually, I didn't realize this, but I don't think there is any or very few lithium-ion factories in India, and they all need to come out of China. And the problem with getting lithium into India is that there's huge tariffs. So lithium-ion batteries are just not that popular in India, and in fact, lead-acid batteries are. Now, one of the reasons for this is because it's a traditional battery, it's old, people kind of know what they're doing, and so with them. And so the market in India is actually ramping up for home energy storage systems based on lithium, based on lead-acid batteries. And the funny thing is that I think it comes from their cultural ethos, is that they think, right, if it's not working, I'm just going to open the case and do a little tinker and see if I can get it working properly, and then we'll plug and play and off we go. So you can probably get away with it if you do that with a lead-acid battery. It may not work to its optimum anymore, but do that with a lithium-ion and you're in big trouble, big trouble. So it's really interesting to see. We don't hear about markets in India necessarily so much, but these are taking off. The other thing we know about is that lead-acid batteries are now being used in tuk-tuks, and in India that's a huge market. So it's interesting just to see where the different types of technologies are being used, and that it's not necessarily about the battery, but about consumerism, about money, about tariffs, about controls, and what's available in your particular area. So if we go just to looking at supporting our home into a bigger scenario, and that's, can we go off-grid in communities? So there is a couple of communities which are, I think, small hubs of individuals or householders situated in the same sort of area going off-grid. But I think this town, Gelion, is actually a perfect example of a town that's connected to the grid right now, but wants to get off the grid. So can they do it? Well, they reckon that they collectively spend, all the residents, there's 300 residents, and they think they collectively spend about $700,000 a year on electricity. And over half of that, so 55% of that, goes into maintenance. So that's the transmission wires and the poles, all that sort of stuff. So a huge amount of their costs goes into just maintaining an old grid system. So they'd like to get off the grid. One of the advantages of the town is that it actually lies, it's on the border of New South Wales and Queensland, a little bit inland, and it actually lies at the very end of the electricity grid. So if they would disconnect the grid, they're not going to then upset a town further down the track who's going, hey, what about me? So they don't need to disrupt energy to neighbouring communities. So what they have decided to do is do a lottery system where they all, I think they have some money from the government or some sort of renewable energy system, grant system where they're pushing solar. They've bought some solar, they want to buy some solar panels, and they're going to put them on homes via a lottery system. So everyone puts their name in the hat, and you and you will get the first solar panels. And some of the savings that those individual residents get then pulled into a pot, and from that pot, as it builds up over time, they'll buy more solar panels and put them on other homes. Now, obviously to go off grid, we need different forms of energy storage, and batteries are one of the things that they've been looking at. And everyone who knows about this project will be putting up a proposal to put batteries into the homes of this town. I don't know if it's going ahead. I've had a look in the news and I can't find anything that's coming up over the last year. When I first heard about this, it does take time. So looking at the positives of why this town might want to get off the grid, what is the cons? Well, it's going to cost an awful lot of money in terms of infrastructure, so the solar systems, the battery systems, any other energy storage that you might have, the wiring, is going to cost an estimated $7 million to go off grid. Now, if we were just to say $700,000 a year, you probably look, and then there's always extra costs, and as time goes on, the costs escalate. So you're probably looking at a 10 to 15 year payback time at a best guess. But in the long run, 10 to 15 years isn't really that long. and down the track, these residents would actually be sustainable and self-sufficient. They would also have to account for the fact that in 10 to 15 years' time, you will need to replace your battery system. So there is ongoing cost, but they're probably, once you've paid back the system, probably not as much as $700,000 a year. They also would need permission to cut the cord, and there's possibly regulatory issues with the energy supplier. Now, the energy supplier is not going to go, yep, go, bye, see ya, because it's a loss of money. They're going to have to take down the grid structure, all that sort of stuff. So, yes, it is possible, but there is a lot of, let's say, paperwork to get through to be able to do that. So I think this is an interesting example to watch. Perhaps we'll see some success in a couple of years' time as they start. Hopefully they can get on the road to be able to do this. So what happens if we need to go completely off-grid? Now, one of the main areas that is supported these days by batteries, or needs to be supported by batteries, is remote telco stations. These stations, there's over 650,000 plus towers worldwide. I think in India there may be even 400,000 that we know of alone, so I'm not sure how accurate that number is. And they sit often, to be able to create a network for telecommunications, they sit in remote places. And particularly in Australia, some of these places are so remote you can only access them maybe once or twice a year. So you need to be able to get in when it's the water levels are down, or there's, the roads are actually accessible. And you forget that in this day and age, not every area is accessible all the time. So what they do is they have a diesel generator that runs constantly to maintain the power requirements for this telco grid, telco tower. And the problem with that is that it's generally oversized to accommodate for any, the fact that you can't get in there and maintain it regularly, or you need to have excess fuel to last for 6 months, or things like that. So it's oversized and it's not running efficiently. So this is a huge contribution to carbon emissions, and then the cost goes up because of that. So here again, we've got another example of the ultra battery used to support a telco base. This is based in New South Wales again, just south of Sydney. I don't know who the telco customer is. They don't want anyone to know. So this is a photo of the site, but who knows where it is or who owns it. It's a 48-volt system, and what they've achieved is without battery storage, without photovoltaic in the background, just using battery storage, they've saved 50% on their diesel costs. And so that is a payback of less than 2 years just by putting a battery system in. So how does it work? Well, here is a remote telco tower, and you have, in this case, we're showing diesel only with no storage whatsoever. So we have a diesel running in the background, and the diesel switches on to follow the load required across the 24-hour period. This diesel generator is a 10 kilowatt diesel generator, and it's typically operating at 2 to 3 kilowatts, which is well below its rating. So it's operating at about 20% of its optimal output. So what happens if we were to put that, in the same scenario, put in solar panels without battery storage? Well, we still have our baseline load, so this is the red line here, and we see the diesel generator operating when it's required. But as the sun comes up and the PV kicks in, we see that basically the diesel generator drops off in use in opposition to to the amount of energy coming in from the solar. And then so we get about 6 hours on a cloudy day, and then it all drops off as the sun goes down and the diesel generator kicks in. But once again, the generator is still 10 kilowatt size, and it's operating at 2.5 kilowatts, so it's still chasing the load across most of the day, and it's not, again, running at its highest efficiency, which is up here. So let's look at energy storage without PV. So it's just the diesel generator and then a battery in here. So what happens is that we turn on the battery overnight, and so we have a constant load. So at midnight, we turn on the battery, and the battery is at, say, 60% state of charge. And with the constant load, it slowly drains to about 20% state of charge. The system will go, oh no, it's a lead-acid battery, we don't drop below 20% state of charge, so the generator will switch on. It will run at its optimal capacity of 10 kilowatts. It will cover the base load that is required and also recharge the battery, in this case, up to 70%. So the battery here is running in partial state of charge between 20% and 70%. The generator then switches off once it's recharged, and the load is supported just by the battery until it drops down to a 20% level, at which point the generator kicks in again and recharges the battery. And that goes on and on over the course of the day. What we do see is that rather than running the generator constantly and it having to chase the load, is that it's running only 3 or 4 times a day, and it's running at its optimal capacity. So it's saving fuel because it's not running all the time, and it's most efficient on its fuel consumption when it operates at its proper spec. So in this case, this is when they have saved 50% of their diesel costs just by installing a battery. Now, if we combine it all together, so we've got our diesel generator, we've got our PV, and we've got our battery system. Here, the diesel generator has kicked in, it's recharging our battery, it then turns itself off. This is overnight, so the battery supports the constant load. When it drops down to a time where it needs to be recharged, the generator kicks in. It doesn't need to kick in for very long because now the sun's coming up and the solar is supporting the load as well. So the generator turns itself off, and the solar supports the load, and when it can, recharges the battery. At the end of the day, the battery is fairly depleted, so the generator kicks in, gives us almost a complete recharge, and then turns itself off. So here, the diesel generator is operating even far less and at optimal capacity. So so here we really start to see significant savings once we combine all these technologies together. So what I wanted to show you is a cost-benefit model of what happens when we put these batteries into a system like this and add solar. What we need to consider is the amount of fuel savings, the cost of maintenance, or how much or how little you need to maintain the site. We'll look at the replacement costs of the generator, the replacement costs of the batteries, and then hopefully you'll see what the environmental benefits are from that. So I'll just change over. So it's a little bit clunky to look at, but bear with me and we'll work the way through it. So this is something that was developed by a friend of mine who works for a New Zealand company called Enetel. Enetel make battery management systems, they make inverters, they can create the whole package to be able to talk to the interface between the grid, the energy system, the battery, the whole shebang. They're a great little company. I promote them because they're Kiwis. I'm just biased. But Murray has created this spreadsheet, and I did a little bit of work with him, so this is why I'm aware of this work. It is a model, it's not perfect, but I want to just use it to illustrate how we can, how we can save money and what's really going on when we start to look in depth at putting batteries into a system. So here we have, what we are looking at is a system where there is no hybrid technology. So there's no batteries and no solar, and comparing that when we put solar in with batteries. So we're going to assume for each case that the site load is 3 kilowatt hours. The generator size is, that would be about 18 kilowatts. That's just a simple conversion depending on the size of the generator that you choose, so you don't need to worry about all that too much. So this is defined by the customer, the site load. We then, if we look down here, we then want to put in a battery that's going to work. So the customer would come along and say, we have a site, we want the battery to provide, I don't know, let's say 500 watts. You'd then go, well, what's the size of your system? Let's say it's 48 volts. You'd then do the calculation and say 500 divided by 48 gives you 24, because the lead acid battery is a 2-volt system, so there's 24 cells. So you get your calculation and say 500 divided by 24, that's a 20 watt per cell system. You then go to your battery tables. Now each manufacturer has different battery tables for each battery that they produce. And you look down that table and you say, it needs to operate to 1.85 volts, and you literally read across that table and say, that figure of the watts or the ampere hours or however you've calculated matches that size battery. And that's how you choose your battery. So I've just put in a battery that would match the appropriate rating, and it's, I think this is from Excite, it's just a battery, SBS is their branding for that particular battery. So we're just going to keep the battery constant here. The battery is, because it's a lead acid battery, we probably don't want to drain it more than 30%. We don't want to drain it completely, so we've chosen in this case to only let it drop to 30% depth of discharge. The other thing to actually be aware of is that we then include in things like service running intervals. We don't want to service it any more than 500 hours. We then put in a basic cost unit, which is for servicing and call-out charges. So it's in US dollars. We just put in a standard figure here. Cost of replacing the generator, 20,000 US dollars. And generator runtime, 30,000 hours before we want to replace the generator. So we keep those all constant. Solar only, no, we want solar in this to model this and keep it the same. And then we put in the solar output. So for case 1, we don't want solar support. For case 2, we're going to say the solar will give us 4 kilowatts. Then in case 3, the solar will give us 8 kilowatts. And the solar maximum average is about 6 hours per day. So then what we do is, so that all comes out in the wash behind the count, because there is a whole lot of stuff behind this calculator which manipulates those figures. But what we want to look at is what happens when we start varying what components contribute to the generator. So I'm just going to, how should I do this? So let's have a look first at the case where there is no hybrids involved. So there's no solar and there's no batteries installed, and the diesel generator is chasing the load and it's operating 24/7. So we can see that the diesel consumed is probably 2,000 litres a day, and then and the cost of that over time is 17,000, and the monthly running costs come out at just over $2,000. And that's based on the installation of the diesel generator and the running costs for the fuel. So what we look at is the purple line here. So this model has assumed actually that the generator is already installed, and over time it costs X amount of dollars to run that generator, and then it's been running for a certain amount of time. The generator is depleted, so they have to replace it, and there's another cost. So here, after 36 months, your cost of supporting that telco grid or off-grid site is already up to $100,000, and that keeps going as the generator is running, and then there's another generator requirement here, and on it goes. So fairly significant costs. What happens when we then put in a solar system and the that works better, and a battery? Well, so let's make sure I talk about the right line. So we've got the green case, we've got no solar support, just the battery. So here we go. Here we are running the battery with the diesel generator, and because it's in the battery, we don't, over 48 months, we then need to replace the generator. So using a battery, we've extended the life of the system just a little bit more, and on we go again. So here again, we've got another unit cost, and this one here is probably because we've now come up to about 10 years of battery service life, and we now need to replace the batteries bank. But what we can see is that there's already a huge cost saving just because we've put in a battery system. Again, we go back to the case 2, where we've now got 4 kilowatts of photovoltaic energy coming in. And again, we look at that line, and once we see here we've got the initial cost of putting in the solar and the battery system, but we are starting to extend the amount of time that the generator can run because it's not being used as much. So your capital costs are starting to drop a lot, and now we're up to 60 months here. And then we see the general costs of refueling and maintenance, but we don't see another step change in the costs up to 120 months on this model. The last case is we've got 8 kilowatts of photovoltaic energy coming into the system, and it's supported by the same batteries. And we have the initial costs of all the batteries and the solar, but we are not seeing any output until 10 years, and that's probably the model doesn't break it down, but my guess would be that the battery system is what's being replaced here, because the batteries typically have 10 to 12 years of life in this scenario. So instead of over, let's say, a 10-year period where you're close to $250,000 to run this one telco system off-grid, we're now down to $100,000. So huge cost savings over the life of that. And you multiply that out, not just by 1, but by 100 over the country for your grid system, and the costs really start to come out. And you can see why. I hope you can see why that it's actually really viable to start integrating batteries into these systems. Now, if I look at the right place, we'll just bring that back. So here are the numbers over financial benefits. Savings per year with just the PV, with just the batteries is $11,000, 15 for a small PV system, and 20,000 for a larger PV system. But then we're looking at fairly significant savings over 5 years for 100 sites. And again, the payback period is just over 2 years in this scenario. The energy savings are huge as well. 30,000 kilowatt hours, and look at how much tons of CO2 we have actually managed to save because we're not running that generator all the time, 24/7. So I really hope this model actually sort of pins down some real numbers. It is not perfect, it is a model, but I think it's really relevant as it does actually show all the costs and savings that you can see in just one telco site. So that's all I have to show you today. In fact, that's almost perfect timing. Again, I just want to acknowledge Robert Stevenson from eCult, who has provided these examples to actually speak through and show you some real-life examples that are happening here in Australia, and Murray Waimaa from Enetel in Christchurch, New Zealand, who has built that model over time. Thank you very much to those guys, and thank you for your attention.